Greetings, gents, and welcome to episode 8 of Econoclasm. Apologies, I'm a little under the weather, so my voice is going to sound even worse than it usually does. Today I'll be talking about Russia and Ukraine, and the whole situation that is seemingly trying to drag the world into nuclear war. So I'm going to start with a little background, both on the current Ukrainian government situation over the past decade, some background on the NATO situation with Russia, basically for the past few decades, since the fall of the Soviet Union, and then get into kind of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and the developments since then, and kind of where we're at right now, and why we're risking, global thermonuclear war over one of the most corrupt governments in Europe. That would be Ukraine. I'm going to try and make the episode not go too long. Obviously, I could sit here for hours and go in deep detail on everything, but I won't. If you want intense, detailed study, go find anything by Scott Horton. He can provide all the information that you could ever want on it. He's got a new book out called Provoked that pretty heavily details a lot of the situation in Eastern Europe with Russia, Ukraine, and NATO. And that can give you a lot better in-depth analysis. I'm going to try to keep a bit more surface and just what you need to know. Obviously, always do your own research. Look up the facts. If you don't, agree with me off the bat, I would advise don't go to official NATO and U.S. government services or resources, because that's a very biased source of information. You might as well be going to ask Vladimir Putin about it if you want just that same level of biased stance. Don't trust one side of the war. Actually, I think I'm going to start with the history of NATO post-Cold War, because that is important background to understand why the situation with the Ukrainian government was so important. So NATO was the West's answer to the Warsaw Pact, the Soviet Union's military alliance. So NATO was the, quote-unquote freedom, pro-democracy, pro-capitalism, to the extent that the West actually was those things. It was their military alliance to protect Europe from the Soviet Union and communism. So obviously, the Cold War happens, Soviet Union collapses, and then the big bad boogeyman of the communist Soviet Union is gone. But NATO doesn't disappear. And the new Russian Federation that comes from the fall of the Soviet Union, talks to the U.S. and talks about NATO, and the U.S. says, oh yeah, we're not going to push NATO past Germany. We don't need to do any of that. So NATO won't go any east of Germany. You don't have to worry about it. And Russia's like, okay, fine. But go look at a map of countries that are in NATO, and you can pretty clearly see it's fairly east of Germany at this point. You have in 1999, Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic joined NATO. In 2004, Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia all joined NATO. In 2009, Albania and Croatia joined NATO. 2017, Montenegro joins NATO. 2020, North Macedonia joins NATO. And they probably would have joined sooner if Greece wasn't throwing a hissy fit over the name of Macedonia. And then, in the 2020s, Ukraine starts to try and join NATO. And that's where the issue comes up. The U.S. told Russia that NATO wouldn't expand to the east, but as you can clearly tell, they expanded massively to the east and into Europe, into many countries on Russia's border. Up in the Balkans, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. So, Russia is basically the spiritual successor to the Soviet Union, just, they're not communist and they're not as, you know, militant and hostile to the United States as the Soviet Union was. But still, they're looking at this like, hey, this was created to stop the thing that came before us, and we have like 90% of what was the Soviet Union, so what's going on here? So they get a bit concerned about, hey, this was an anti-Soviet alliance, is it now an anti-Russia alliance? And the US is like, oh, no. It's not any anti-Russia. So Russia's like, okay, I'll call you a bluff. We want to join NATO. Russia tries to get into NATO, and NATO's like, no, you can't get in. I don't know exactly what year it was. Give me a sec. So apparently that was in the year 2000, after the first round of countries to the east of Germany joining NATO. Putin, who at the time was president of Russia, obviously still is, but during his first term, inquires about joining NATO, and the U.S. doesn't go for it, so it's like, that kind of confirms to them, oh, this is an anti-Russia alliance. And then we keep pushing the alliance further and further towards Russia's borders. And it becomes more and more clear, yeah, this is against us. So Russia gets very concerned because an anti-them military alliance is pushing closer and closer to them, including 3 countries on their, actually, no, 4. Because you've got Poland on the border of the little Kaliningrad exclave. So this allows NATO and American troops to be placed right on Russia's border. And obviously not, you got Alaska, but that's a different thing. Over where Alaska is, there's very little, Russian population. Most of the population is in the west, which is right by where NATO is expanding. I remember a statement by Hillary Clinton. I think it might have been during the 2016 presidential campaign at some point in the 2010s. But she said, Russia's moving its troops right along NATO's doorstep. They were moving troops within Russia. NATO had just placed itself right on Russia's doorsteps and claimed that now Russia's the aggressor because they're moving troops within their own country. And then when Ukraine expresses interest in joining NATO, Russia's like, we're going to be completely surrounded by hostile foreign troops. This can't happen. And the Baltic states have a much smaller border with Russia than Ukraine does. It's a massive border those two have. Think about it this way. Flip it around. If Russia had a military alliance with Mexico, Cuba, the Bahamas, Canada, and it completely surrounded us with, Russian troops on all sides, pretty sure most Americans would be worried about that and consider Russia, potentially posing themselves for something against the United States. So try to understand where Russia's coming from when we're trying to put a military alliance that completely encompasses them on all borders. The only thing they have is Belarus, which itself kind of would be surrounded by NATO troops as well. So even though it's a separate country, you basically just have, you get into Belarus with troops, and then you can get into Russia and go into Russia through the Baltics and Ukraine into Kaliningrad. So Russia knows, understandably, is very concerned about NATO at this point. And that's when Ukraine tries to join. Now, the situation with the Ukrainian government. So in 2010, you have a Ukrainian presidential election in which Viktor Yanukovych wins the election. And if you go look at the map of the election, you can see his support is in the east and south of Ukraine, or where the war is currently, being fought over. So Yanukovych becomes president of Ukraine, and he's more pro. The thing that dominated Ukrainian politics was were they going to be more pro-Russia and more ties with Russia, or more Europe and ties with Europe. So Yanukovych comes in, elected by a lot of Ukrainians who are pro-Russian and want more ties with Russia. So he ends up eventually turning more away from Europe and towards more ties with Russia. But, a lot of the pro-Europe Ukrainians don't like it, so he does try to do a bit of a balance between the two, but the damage is done and people want him out. But not the Ukrainians so much as the United States. They don't like the idea of anyone being friendly towards Russia. It's just funny because I remember in the 2012 presidential debate when Mitt Romney said that Russia is the greatest geopolitical ally of the United States. Obama says, "Oh, the 1980s called, they want their foreign policy back." But Obama did everything he could to combat Russia, and, eventually his government backs a coup in Ukraine against Yanukovych. So yeah, the 1980s called, and they say you're doing a great job, Putin, or Obama. Obama's a worse person than Putin, hands down. So my apologies to Vladimir Putin for accidentally calling Obama Putin. That's insult to Putin. And it's not even debatable that the U.S. backed the coup against Yanukovych. U.S. diplomat Victoria Nuland has been recorded on phone calls backing the coup and giving the okay from the U.S. side. So, the U.S. backs the coup against Yanukovych. He flees into Russia. Well, wait, backing up a little bit. Yanukovych understands that a lot of the Ukrainian people are mad because he's moving more towards pro-Russia. He tries to balance out with some deals with Europe, and he even agrees to push up the elections so that the Ukrainian people can democratically decide what they want. The whole talk about the war is, we got to do democracy, but they don't care about Yanukovych being a democratically elected president. They don't care that he pushed up democratic elections to let democracy have a voice. No, the U.S. backs the coup, kicks Yanukovych out. He flees to Russia. So, a lot of the people who supported Yanukovych in eastern and southern Ukraine are pissed. Their guy, who was democratically elected, got kicked out by their political opponents. The very thing that so many Democrats are pissed about that supposedly Trump tried to do on January 6th, but perfectly good and justified and acceptable to happen, in Ukraine in 2014. So, this starts a separatist movement in some provinces. And this is known as the War in Donbass. Something that I really never heard anyone who's now so vocal about Ukraine talking about prior to 2022. People are freaking out because Russia's killing Ukrainians in eastern Ukraine. I didn't hear shit from any of them about Ukraine killing Ukrainians in eastern Ukraine for 8 years prior to Russia's invasion. You can pretend to care all you want, but you only cared when you were told it was time to care. You didn't care about the Ukrainian government massacring its own people for 8 years in eastern Ukraine, from 2014 to 2022. So don't act like you care about Ukraine or the Ukrainian people. No, you're just a puppet of the Western governments who want to be anti-Russia. You only started caring when you were told it was time to care. Because you don't actually know about these things. You just wait till someone tells you it's time to care. So Ukraine tries to join NATO. Russia says this is unacceptable. They've been saying for a while, too, they would refuse to allow Ukraine to join NATO because they're already so surrounded by NATO. They cannot afford to have this massive border with NATO now. So they've been saying time and time again, don't let Ukraine join NATO, we'll invade. They were very clear about it, and then NATO tries to let Ukraine in. So what does Russia do? The thing they've been saying they're going to do for many years. They invade Ukraine. And now people get mad because Russia does what Ukraine had been doing for 8 years, to start killing Ukrainians. Only Russia had been telegraphing it the whole time. They didn't do it because of an immoral coup against democracy. They did it because they needed the most basic security of their country and didn't want NATO troops only a few hundred miles away from their major population centers, with an easy access of invasion through the Ukrainian plains. And that's how the war happened. It wasn't, evil Putin rubbing his hands together saying, I'm going to reform the Soviet Union. Step 1, invade Ukraine. No, it was constant provocation by the US and NATO, constantly pushing and pushing and pushing Russia. And they continue to do it by funding Ukraine, by giving them weapons, by authorizing strikes into Russia with U.S. weaponry now. Thanks, Biden, you dementia-ridden piece of shit with a pedophile, crack-smoking son, who, by the way, was on the board of a Ukrainian energy company and got a lot of money and salary from them. What the fuck does Hunter Biden know about energy in Ukraine? Totally not any corrupt dealings going on there. And yes, the Hunter Biden laptop was 100% real. So now, there's war in Ukraine, between Russia and Ukraine. There was war for 8 years before. No one cared, because no one was told to care. But now, there's an actual interstate war in Europe. And the war could have ended in, I believe, 2022. Russia and Ukraine had a peace deal in place, and they were going to sign it. But guess what? The U.S. didn't like that. No, they wanted thousands more to die and more risk of war, because of course they do. So they send Boris Johnson, who is the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom at the time, and have him talk Ukraine out of the peace agreement. And so now we have another 2 years of war after. Hundreds of thousands more are dead. No closer to a real settlement in the war. And now, Russia's talking using nukes. So that's what we have to deal with. Now the question is it worth nuclear war to protect Ukraine? Well, if you looked at the corruption index or the ranking of corrupt countries, I forget exactly what it's called. But if you looked at it, it had been coming out for years. Every time the list came out yearly, or however frequently they did, Ukraine and Russia were always the bottom two in terms of the most corrupt countries. Russia was the most corrupt. Ukraine was the second most corrupt. I looked it up a few months ago. Russia's now the most corrupt. It says Belarus is the second and Ukraine's the third. They probably just fudged the numbers or pushed it up or just changed the rankings because they couldn't have Ukraine below a ally of Russia. But even still, if you fully take it at its word, Ukraine is the third most corrupt in the country in Europe now, which is weird because they've gotten so much more corrupt through the course of the war. But the war is basically over. Do we want, Eastern Ukraine ruled by corrupt politicians in Kiev or corrupt politicians in Moscow? Such a, massive, important issue. Oh, what city will the corrupt politicians be in who will be ruling Eastern Ukraine? Who gives a shit? Is it worth nuclear war? I sure don't think so. And if you want to talk real corruption, look no further than fucking Vladimir Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, who, by the way, has postponed elections because democracy is so important. It's this great idea that we need to risk nuclear war over. But, we can postpone it. You can say, yeah, there's a war going on. But if democracy is that important, then you can't just throw it aside until it's easy and convenient again. You want to have the argument that you can't have elections because there's war going on. You can't argue that democracy is a sacred cow that needs to be protected at the risk of nuclear war. So he's postponed elections. He's outlawed any opposition parties. He's outlawed the Russian Orthodox Church. You can be arrested for going to church now in Ukraine because, its patriarch is in Moscow. Millions of Ukrainians who are part of the Russian Ukrainian or Orthodox Church are now at risk of imprisonment because Zelensky doesn't like where the patriarch is. That's sure pro-democracy and pro-Western freedom. And then Ukraine's put out, blacklist of American citizens, Brazilians, and others who they declare Kremlin assets because they don't support the U.S. getting involved in a foreign war that could risk nuclear annihilation. This includes people like Tulsi Gabbard, Tucker Carlson, Rand Paul, and Glenn Greenwald. All people who are Kremlin assets because they want to protect the world from nuclear annihilation, World War III, and get involved in a conflict between two very corrupt countries. And then, Zelensky has gone against journalists. One in particular is Gonzalo Lira, who's an American citizen who was imprisoned and tortured and eventually killed by the Ukrainian regime for the crime of criticizing Zelensky. So, great job there, democracy and freedom. Zelensky has easily been one of the most corrupt politicians in Europe since he got elected. He's basically become a dictator. I would argue probably worse than Putin at this point. And he's trying everything he can to hold on to power. He's putting his country through insane amounts of war. He's, demanding that the U.S. give him money because, well, you guys are just selfish. Give me, give me, give me. He's laundering most of it. All to let his people die on the front lines because he needs more control over he needs more area under his corrupt control. So that's what we're risking World War III over. Maybe I can make a second episode just detailing all the various ways Ukraine and Zelensky has been horrible and corrupt since the war broke out. That would be interesting. But yes, we're risking nuclear war over whether the people in eastern Ukraine are ruled by corrupt politicians in Kiev or Moscow. That doesn't seem like it's worth nuclear war to me. That's not even worth sending diplomats over. Let them resolve it themselves. It's not our issue. They would have had it resolved if we didn't get involved. But the U.S. seems hell-bent on causing World War III. For whatever fucking reason, I don't know. Probably to maintain its global hegemony, to prop up the profits of war profiteers and defense contractors in the United States. And who knows, there's pretty good evidence that a decent number of U.S. politicians are outright satanic, so that probably factors into it. This is evil and ridiculous. To risk nuclear war over protecting such a corrupt country like Ukraine, that is only minusculely less corrupt than Russia. It's absolutely not worth it. I sure as hell don't want to die so Ukraine can maybe hold on to its eastern provinces. I don't give a shit. especially with everything that happened leading up to it. It's not my business. I don't want the world to disappear in nuclear hellfire because of that. Sorry. I don't know if that makes me a bad person. I don't think it does. But all these people in the US and West think it's imperative to bring about the end of humanity over it. Over a war that they were simply told to care about because it's Russia. They didn't know about the war in Donbass. I never heard any of these people, complaining about the Saudis committing outright genocide basically in Yemen. They didn't care that the US was going to war with Iraq and Afghanistan. Remember someone said, well, I was a child then. Yeah, jackass. The war in Afghanistan ended only a few months before Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022. So don't act like you were a child when the US was at war with Afghanistan. And then you magically became an adult in between that time. I don't hear anyone complaining about, the war in Ethiopia. That was killing hundreds of thousands. No, you don't care about suffering and death. Because there's plenty of exact same and worse situations that are happening that you don't even know about. Because you weren't told to care about it. Because that's all you'll end up caring about is what the media and government tells you you have to care about. You're not some noble supporter of democracy and freedom and peace. You're a puppet of the US and NATO and their corporate allies and all the fucking shareholders of Raytheon, Boeing, Northrop Grumman, the corrupt state media in the US. You're just a useful puppet of them to support their war to keep the US on top of the world. And if you look at what has been happening with the US on top of the world, it ain't good. The US is the greatest aggressor in the world easily over the past 35 years. Just go look at how many offensive wars the US has fought compared to Russia, Iran, North Korea, Syria, Iraq under Saddam, any boogeyman you want to come up with. Hell, combine them all. The US has still been in more offensive wars. So, yeah. I don't care if Russia gets a couple provinces in eastern Ukraine and NATO doesn't get Ukraine as a member. Not my concern. I'm not going to risk nuclear war over that. Stop pretending like you care about these insane ideals because you've been told to and you don't even understand it properly. If you think Ukraine is some noble bastion of democracy and freedom, you're a fool. I think I need to do an episode all about Zelensky because I really don't like it, and there's a lot not to like about him, and people need to know how much of just a piece of shit he is. I really hope the Russians capture him and behead him live on TV. I want to watch that. But yeah, don't risk nuclear war over Ukraine. I really hope Trump can bring about peace in that war before we, see the nukes fly. The Democrats seem to have a huge problem with the idea of peace over there. Don't know why. I guess they want nuclear war. But if that's what you want, go for it. Leave me the fuck out of it. If you want to die for Ukraine, go over there and die for them. Don't make me die for them. So, in conclusion, fuck Ukraine. Fuck Zelensky. Stay out of the war. Don't bring about a nuclear apocalypse. Thanks for listening.